Bernice Walsh was 67 and no longer counted the days, but rather the hours that dragged by inside Sunset Manor. The nursing home smelled of disinfectant mixed with reheated soup, and each morning began with the metallic squeak of medicine cartwheels. 3 years had passed since her daughter, Astrid, and son-in-law, Marcus, had brought her there, saying it was for her own good. They justified it with speeches about memory lapses and safety, but Bernice knew she had been discarded like a piece of inconvenient furniture. Loneliness weighed more heavily than any diagnosis. The nurses were kind, some even caring, but the emptiness of having no choice was unbearable. Bernice always looked out her bedroom window at the same gray parking lot, decorated with cars of visitors who rarely called for her. Her daughter, Astrid, appeared occasionally, almost always to ask for her signature on a document or to announce cuts in unnecessary expenses. Her smile was practiced, and Bernice learned not to expect affection, only orders disguised as concern. The days blended into a silent routine. Bingo on Sunday afternoons, the TV blaring in the hallways, shallow conversations between residents. Bernice, however, isolated herself. She wasn't one to share her pain. She wrote small reminders in a notebook hidden in the drawer to reassure herself that her memory wasn't failing her, as Astrid claimed. There, she recorded dates, feelings, and even the exact number of days she'd been trapped in that place: 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. What hurt most wasn't the routine, but the feeling of invisibility. Bernice had raised Astrid alone after her husband's death, working 2 jobs, saving every penny to provide her daughter with an education and comfort. Seeing herself now treated like a burden was an open wound. Marcus, her son-in-law, reinforced the discourse of inadequacy, always with an air of superiority. He spoke as if he had already assumed the position of owner of everything that had once been hers. This constant devaluation corroded Bernice from within. The situation began to change one cold winter afternoon. A letter arrived in an official envelope delivered directly by the nursing home administration. Bernice was surprised, as she rarely received mail. Upon opening it, she found a notice from a law firm in Montana. Her older brother, George, had passed away. The news shocked her. They hadn't seen each other in years, separated by long-standing family disagreements, but the emptiness of losing the last link to their childhood hit her hard. What the letter contained next, however, was even more surprising. George had left a will naming Bernice as the primary heir to a 2,000-acre ranch in Yellowstone and a fortune valued at over $8 million. More than just assets, the lawyer said there were a series of personal letters from George addressed to her. Bernice read and reread them in disbelief. This seemed an unlikely turn of events for someone who had been condemned to invisibility. The news didn't stay with her for long. Astrid was the first to show up at the nursing home, visibly nervous. "Mom, you need help dealing with this. An estate this size is a lot of responsibility. You can't make decisions alone," she said, trying to keep her voice gentle, but her eyes betrayed anxiety and interest. Marcus soon joined the conversation, suggesting that she, temporarily, take control of the inheritance until everything was regularized. Bernice listened silently, but this time she didn't swallow easily. The weight of George's letters hadn't yet sunk in, but something was already stirring inside, a flicker of distrust toward her daughter. After all, Astrid had never shown true care, only control. Now, with her fortune at stake, her presence was sudden and insistent. For the first time in a long time, Bernice felt not just a frail old woman, but someone who could have a choice. Days later, attorney Jonathan Mills visited the nursing home to meet with her in person. He brought with him not only documents from the will, but also the first letters written by George. Bernice trembled as she opened the envelope. In the letters, her brother expressed regret for not being present, apologized for past arguments, and recalled childhood memories on the ranch. Amidst words of affection, George was direct. "Don't let anyone steal what's yours. This inheritance is your chance to start over." Reading those letters was like receiving a shot of life. Bernice cried, but not from sadness. It was a mixture of longing, pain, and hope. Each sentence seemed written to heal a wound Astrid and Marcus had opened. Jonathan, noticing her emotion, calmly explained that the entire estate was legally protected and that any attempt at manipulation could be challenged in court. For the first time in years, Bernice felt someone was on her side. Astrid and Marcus, realizing they were losing ground, intensified the pressure. They began taking their grandchildren, Tommy and Sarah, to the nursing home, trying to manipulate their grandmother emotionally. "You don't want them to suffer because of rash decisions, do you?" Astrid would say tearfully. Marcus reinforced this with calculated looks. Bernice, previously vulnerable, now felt something new: courage. George's words echoed like a silent call not to give in. The turning point came at a meeting held at the lawyer's office. Astrid, impatient, lost control in front of witnesses and accused her mother of incompetence, threatening to commit her to a psychiatric clinic if she insisted on keeping possession of the inheritance. The silence that followed was heavy. Bernice, however, didn't lower her eyes. She took a deep breath, straightened her coat, and said firmly, "Enough. I know what you've done to me, and it won't happen again." The entire room felt the impact of that moment. After that meeting, Jonathan reassured Bernice that she had sufficient evidence to defend herself. Banks. Documents showed suspicious withdrawals made by Astrid in her mother's name, as well as records of forged signatures on loan agreements. Bernice was shaken to realize this wasn't just neglect, but deliberate fraud. The pain of betrayal weighed heavily, but with it came an unexpected strength, indignation that turned into action. Upon returning to the nursing home, the routine no longer felt the same. With every step down the hallway, Bernice felt like she no longer belonged there. The food served, the repetitive voices, the rigid schedules, none of it represented who she was or could ever be again. The ranch described in George's letters came to life in her imagination. The smell of wet earth, the sounds of animals, the open space. That contrast made it clear that staying there was a prison, not a place of care. Astrid wouldn't give up. She started calling every day, leaving long messages full of emotional blackmail. Sometimes she said she couldn't care for her own children. Without the inheritance money, sometimes she accused her mother of selfishness. Bernice, however, now wrote down every detail and gave it to Jonathan. The lawyer advised her not to respond directly, just to gather everything. It was the first time Bernice had turned grief into strategy. With Jonathan's help, she began the formal process to end her stay at Sunset Manor. The nursing home, upon receiving the notice, expressed surprise. Few residents were able to leave on their own. The staff, though kind, tried to dissuade her, explaining the risks of living alone. Bernice thanked them, but stood by her decision. For the first time in years, she didn't ask anyone for approval. She was determined to leave. The day of her departure was a momentous one. Bernice packed her things into 2 small suitcases, simple clothes, her notebook, and George's letters. There wasn't much to take, but each item held symbolic value. As she walked through the nursing home's doors, the morning chill hit her face and brought a new sensation: freedom. The lawyer's car was waiting for her, and as she got in, Bernice realized she was crossing an invisible line between a past of submission and the beginning of something greater. The drive to Yellowstone was long, but each mile seemed to melt away the weight she carried. In the passenger seat, Bernice remained silent, staring out the window, as if the world were returning to her. The snow-capped mountains, frozen rivers, and vast landscape reminded her of George's descriptions. It was as if he were guiding this new beginning. Even from his absence, her heart pounded, not with fear but with anticipation. When she finally arrived at the ranch, Bernice was speechless. The wooden gate, engraved with her brother's initials, slowly opened, revealing acres of land stretching as far as the eye could see. There were horses, lined fences, an imposing barn, and the well-preserved light-colored wooden main house. The grandeur of the place contrasted with the years of confinement in the asylum. Bernice took a deep breath and murmured, "I'm home." It was the first time in a long time that the word made sense. Nearby neighbors arrived in the following days, bringing food, offering help, and telling stories about George. Bernice listened attentively to each story, discovering sides of her brother she hadn't known. He had been respected, beloved in the community, someone who quietly helped without expecting anything in return. The letters he left for her gained even more value as they confirmed who he had become. Bernice felt both pride and a responsibility to honor this legacy. The adjustment wasn't immediate. The house seemed enormous to someone who had lived in a small room for 3 years. At night, the silence of the countryside frightened her, and sometimes Bernice cried alone, frightened by the new reality. But at dawn, the sun streaming through the windows and the smell of freshly brewed coffee reassured her that she was on the right path. The solitude there was different. It wasn't abandonment, it was choice. While organizing, Bernice and Jonathan moved forward with the legal process. With the evidence gathered, it became clear that Astrid and Marcus had financially exploited their mother for years. There were withdrawals, transfers, and even attempts to sell assets without consent. The case was taken to court, and though painful, Bernice remained steadfast. She no longer acted solely for herself, but for the memory of George, who had trusted her to be the guardian of what he had built. The hearings were tense. Astrid, when confronted with the documents, cried and tried to change the narrative, accusing her mother of ingratitude. Marcos maintained his arrogant posture, denying everything, but the evidence was irrefutable. Bernice, sitting before the judge, remained calm. There was no shouting, no vengeance in her words, only the naked truth. "I'm not incapable. I was treated this way so they could take what was mine." That sentence echoed loudly in the room. The outcome of the case ruled in Bernice's favor. The court acknowledged the fraud and reinstated her full autonomy over all assets. For Astrid and Marcus, what remained was public embarrassment and the obligation to make good on some of the damages. For Bernice, more than the money, the victory was symbolic. She had regained her voice. As she left the courtroom, she no longer felt like the fragile woman from Sunset Manor, but who had regained the right to exist in her own story. In the days following her courtroom victory, Bernice felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, she woke up without fear of what Astrid and Marcus might do. The ranch, which had previously seemed too big for her, began to feel like a family space. She began exploring every corner of the property, opening doors, cleaning out closets, and gradually transforming the house into a home with her own stamp. Mornings took on a new routine. Bernice drank coffee on the porch, watching the horses graze in the open field. The silence, which had previously frightened her, now brought her peace. The notebook she had used in the nursing home to record days of solitude became a gratitude journal. In it, she noted every small achievement, learning to light a fireplace, organizing the kitchen, preparing her first meal alone in that house. Even at 67, she allowed herself to learn new things. She hired a young neighbor to help her with the practical side of the ranch, but insisted on being involved in everything. She asked questions, observed, and took notes. The young man laughed when he saw her in boots trying to carry bales of hay, but he respected her determination. Bernice didn't just want to live there, she wanted to feel like the place was hers too, through her own efforts. The community's support was crucial. People who had been close to George naturally reached out to her, bringing stories, memories, and even old photographs. Bernice discovered that, despite the distance, her brother had never stopped talking about her. This moved her deeply, as it made her realize that, even in the years when she felt forgotten, she was still remembered fondly. At times, the pain of her relationship with Astrid returned like a shadow. It was impossible to erase the feeling of betrayal, and George's letters were a constant comfort. Whenever sadness threatened to overwhelm her, she reread passages where her brother reminded her of her strength. That was enough to make her get up from her chair and continue to reorganize her life. Little by little, Bernice discovered the power of choosing how to use her time. She visited the small town nearby, frequented the local library, and even signed up for a gardening class offered by the community. She felt alive again, as if each day were a chance to regain stolen years. The freedom was not just physical, but mental. Despite her painful past, Bernice never stopped loving her grandchildren. She knew Astrid would try to use them again as emotional currency, but she decided to act differently. She created a college fund in Tommy and Sarah's name, ensuring they would have security in the future. It wasn't a gesture to buy affection, but a way to prove to herself that she could still be generous without allowing herself to be exploited. When Astrid learned of the fundraising, her reaction was unexpected. Instead of gratitude, she launched into more accusations, claiming that her mother was distancing her from her own children. Bernice didn't respond. For the first time, she understood that she didn't have to win every argument. Silence was also a choice, and distance was sometimes the greatest act of protection. At the ranch, Bernice found space to reflect on herself. She would sit by the fireplace at night and think about how much she had accepted life without a solution, believing she had no alternative. Now, she understood that starting over was possible, even when it seemed too late. This realization filled her with energy, as if she still had so much ahead of her. Over time, people began to seek her out not just as George's heir, but as an inspiration. Widows in the community, older women also facing loneliness, sought in Bernice a friend, someone who would listen without judgment. She discovered, unintentionally, that her story had the power to motivate other women not to give up on themselves. It was during this process that Bernice felt something profound. She was regaining not only her freedom, but also her dignity. The ranch ceased to be merely a material inheritance and became a symbol of rebirth. Every simple task, planting a seedling, feeding the animals, writing in her journal, was proof that she still had control over her own destiny. And for the first time in years, Bernice smiled in the mirror without having to force it. The reflection showed not just a 67-year-old woman, but a whole woman who had passed through the darkness of invisibility and now walked with her head held high. The past could not be erased, but it no longer defined who she was. As the months passed, Bernice realized that the peace she had achieved was not just the result of Astrid's distance, but of an active choice to put herself first. She began to organize the inherited finances with Jonathan's support. No longer afraid of being deceived, but with a curiosity to understand every detail. She participated in meetings, asked questions, and made decisions confidently. This independence was what filled her with the greatest pride. The ranch flourished with her. The fields grew new crops, the barn was renovated, and the house became frequented by neighbors and friends who came for coffee or to listen to stories. Bernice, who had lived isolated in a nursing home room for so long, now had a living room full of life, laughter, and conversation that stretched until sunset. The contrast was so stark that sometimes she herself found it hard to believe. Despite this, Astrid didn't give up trying to get closer. In some phone calls, her daughter sounded less aggressive, almost remorseful. Marcus, on the other hand, distanced himself after the court defeat, wrapped up in his own problems. His absence made Astrid realize how much she had lost by breaking her mother's trust. But Bernice was in no rush to get back together. Time had to teach more than words. Her grandchildren, Tommy and Sarah, began visiting her at the ranch more often. At first, it was a shy interaction, fraught with apprehension about their mother's influence. But soon the children felt at ease, running through the fields, helping feed the horses, and discovering a side of their grandmother they had never known. Bernice made a point of showing that, despite everything, their love was never in doubt. These encounters brought back something Bernice believed she had lost, a sense of belonging to her family. She knew Astrid still had much to reflect on, but seeing her grandchildren smiling, she understood that part of the healing would come through them. Creating good memories for the children was her way of breaking the cycle of pain that had marked her recent years. One afternoon, Astrid showed up unexpectedly at the ranch. She brought no papers, no demands, just a tired, changed expression. Bernice greeted her cautiously, offering her coffee. The silence was heavy at first, but soon her daughter began to speak. Through suppressed tears, she admitted that Marcus had distanced herself, that she was overwhelmed, and that she finally realized the wrongs committed against her own mother. Bernice listened but didn't respond immediately. The hurt was still too great to be erased with a request. She knew that true reconciliation wouldn't come from words, but from consistent actions over time. So firmly, she simply replied, "I'm not closing doors, but boundaries now exist. If you want to get closer, you'll have to learn to respect them." It was enough to make it clear that the dynamic would never be the same again. In the following days, Bernice reflected deeply on that conversation. She didn't want to repeat her submissive past, but she also didn't want to carry resentment for the rest of her life. She found balance in the idea of establishing a healthy distance, being open to rebuilding bonds, but without giving up the autonomy she had gained. This approach made her feel like an adult in front of her own daughter, as if the roles had finally reversed. Meanwhile, life on the ranch continued as usual. Bernice hired people to help her expand local production, not just as a business, but as a way to generate jobs in the community. She took pleasure in seeing the place thrive, knowing that it also reflected George's trust in her. Each new project was a way to honor her brother's memory. On weekends, the house would fill with grandchildren. Sarah enjoyed horseback riding, while Tommy helped his grandmother organize documents or work on the computer. Bernice laughed at how technology, which once seemed so distant, now became a bridge between generations. She no longer felt outdated, but an active part of their lives. This, for her, was one of her greatest victories. Even in moments of solitude, Bernice no longer felt that desperate emptiness. She learned to appreciate the silence of starry nights in Yellowstone, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and even rainy days, when she would retreat with a book and a blanket by the fireplace, There was a serenity in knowing she didn't owe anyone explanations, that she could choose every detail of her life. Over time, Astrid's visits became more frequent, always with a more humble air. Bernice watched, in no rush to trust. Her daughter seemed to finally understand that she was no longer the same fragile and manipulable mother she'd been before, but a woman who had risen again. And while there was still a long road to complete forgiveness, Bernice no longer carried the weight of her grief alone. With her newfound stability, Bernice began to realize that the ranch could be more than a home. She had resources, space, and, above all, a desire to give back what life had given her. She talked with Jonathan and decided to create a small scholarship program for local youth, especially those unable to afford college. It wasn't just about money, it was about providing opportunities that previously seemed unattainable. This decision quickly resonated throughout the community. Teachers, parents, and even local leaders began to view her with even more respect. Many were surprised to discover that this woman, who until recently had been forgotten in a nursing home, was now transforming the future of young people who never even knew her. Bernice felt that finally her life had a greater purpose than enduring loneliness. The grandchildren, upon learning about the project, were proud. Tommy, curious, asked how the She-Emi scholarships worked, while Sarah dreamed of helping her grandmother choose the recipients. These conversations brought Bernice even closer to the children and showed that, despite Astrid's mistakes, there was still much love to blossom in that part of the family. Astrid, for her part, watched from afar. She no longer made demands nor tried to manipulate. Her mother's stance, firm and generous at the same time, left her without arguments. It was as if Bernice had finally turned the tables. Showing she could be independent and kind, she exposed the pettiness that had dominated Astrid in recent years. There was a special moment when Bernice realized how much she had changed. It was during a visit to the ranch by a group of young scholarship students. As she showed them the animals and told stories about Uncle George, she saw genuine admiration in their eyes. She felt useful, valued, almost like a mentor. There she realized that her story didn't end in the painful past, but was being rewritten in the present. Still, there were days when memories of the nursing home came back, like bitter-sweet memories. The sound of the medicine cart, the smell of disinfectant, the white walls. At those times, Bernice would take a deep breath and remind herself she was no longer trapped, no longer invisible. These memories didn't come to paralyze her, but to reinforce how far she had come. With her routine structured, she began to indulge in small pleasures. She bought new furniture, redecorated rooms, and organized a library with antique and modern books. With each detail she added to the house, she felt she was erasing some of the shadow of abandonment she carried. The ranch increasingly became a reflection of her new phase, welcoming, free, and full of life. George's letters, carefully kept in a box, continued to be her companion. Every now and then she would reread one at random and find advice in them that always seemed appropriate for the moment. It was as if her brother had foreseen that she would need constant guidance to avoid getting lost amidst so many changes. One evening, around the fire, Bernice shared excerpts from the letters with her grandchildren. She told stories of her and George's childhood, of simple days in the countryside, of fights and reconciliations. The children listened fascinated, as if they were in front of a family treasure. It was at that moment that Bernice understood that the most important legacy she could leave was not money, but memories preserved with truth. Gradually, even Astrid began to participate in these moments, still shy and awkward. There was no applause or immediate forgiveness, but there was space. Bernice set the pace unhurriedly, without relinquishing her autonomy. Her daughter began to understand that she would need to earn every gesture of trust with actions, not empty words. The ranch, which at first seemed merely a material possession, became a meeting place. Friends, neighbors, young students, and family gathered there on various occasions. Bernice, who had previously believed herself invisible, was now the center of a network of relationships built on respect. This silent recognition was the greatest gift she could receive. And when she looked in the mirror before bed, Bernice no longer saw just a survivor, but someone who had learned to live again. Her aging face bore marks of pain, but also of strength. Each wrinkle seemed to tell not only of the years that had passed, but also of the victory of having regained control of her own life. Over time, Bernice realized that the wound left by Astrid wouldn't disappear overnight. There were still nights when she cried silently, feeling the pain of being rejected by the one she loved most. But now, the difference was in how she dealt with those feelings. Instead of letting them consume her, she accepted them, wrote about them in her journal, and the next day rose to face whatever came. The diary became an inseparable ally. In it, Bernice recorded both her daily sorrows and triumphs. She wrote about her grandchildren's laughter, the progress of the crops, and every new gesture Astrid made that showed regret. Writing gave her clarity, helped her see how much she was growing, and reminded her that her life was no longer determined by the actions of others. Astrid, for her part, began to show changes. She began visiting the ranch without asking for anything in return, offering to help with small tasks. At first, Bernice was wary, but she couldn't help but notice the effort. She wasn't the daughter she dreamed of having, but it was a step in the right direction. Trust, which had been shattered, was now being rebuilt, like building a house brick by brick. The grandchildren also played a crucial role in this transformation. They told their mother how much they enjoyed being with their grandmother, how much they learned from her, and this seemed to touch Astrid in a new way. Seeing her own children grow closer to the mother she had scorned opened a crack in Astrid's pride, forcing her to acknowledge her mistakes more deeply. Even so, Bernice was undeterred. She knew her daughter harbored ambition and fragility, and that regret could easily be lost amidst the hardships, so she maintained firm boundaries. Decisions about the ranch and the money remained solely under her control, and Astrid understood there was no longer room for manipulation. This balance was the foundation of any possible reconciliation. In the community, Bernice became seen as a role model, not only because of George's legacy, but also because of the way she rose up after years of invisibility. Many women her age approached her to talk, sharing stories of abandonment or loneliness. Bernice listened attentively and offered what she knew best, her experience of overcoming adversity. It was as if her pain had gained purpose, inspiring others not to give up. There was one incident when a local widow confided her family wanted to commit her against her will, claiming she was unable to live alone. Bernice listened silently, then said, "They can only decide that if you let them. No one has the right to steal your voice." The phrase resonated, and the woman would repeat it many times afterward. Bernice realized then that she had become the kind of support she herself once needed. This new attitude didn't erase the bad memories, but it gave them new meaning. Her time at Sunset Manor was no longer just a period of suffering, but proof that she had endured and overcome. Whenever she recalled the white hallways and the smell of disinfectant, she no longer felt just pain, but also pride in having found the strength to leave. Astrid continued to struggle with her own conscience. In some conversations, she would express sincere regrets, confess insecurities, and even cry in front of her mother. Bernice listened to her, but didn't offer immediate forgiveness. She knew that forgiveness was a process, not a sudden declaration. Simply listening without exploding was progress, and it showed how much she had grown emotionally. The relationship between the two gradually found a new form. It wasn't the same as before, based on dependence and abuse. Now there was room for respect. Astrid knew she could no longer yell, demand, or manipulate. Bernice, on the other hand, understood she could protect herself without having to completely withdraw. It was a delicate balance but achievable. At the Gyo ranch, life continued with renewed energy. Bernice discovered the joy of tending a garden, planting flowers that beautified the entrance to the house. She told herself that these flowers were symbols of her new phase, delicate yet resilient enough to withstand the changes of the weather. Each sprout that emerged was a reminder that life could be reborn, even after periods of drought. And, as she walked among the flowers on a sunny afternoon, Bernice realized something essential. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Her achievement wasn't just about the money or the ranch, but about simply taking back her life. She was in control of her own time, her own choices, and her own destiny. This certainty was, for her, the greatest victory. As life on the ranch became increasingly organized, Bernice began to feel like an essential part of the local community. She participated in events, helped with social initiatives, and gradually became a respected presence at community meetings. For many, it was surprising to see how a 67-year-old woman, once considered fragile and discarded, was now leading important conversations and inspiring change. The educational funds she had created began to show results. Young beneficiaries sent letters of thanks, some even showing up at the ranch to share their first achievements. Bernice was moved by each story, remembering how, years ago, she was the one who wrote letters hidden in her notebook so as not to lose her memory of herself. Now, she received words that placed her as a beacon of hope. Astrid watched everything in silence. At first, she viewed her mother's actions with suspicion, believing it was a ploy to humiliate her. But over time, she began to understand there was no competition. Bernice didn't do anything out of vanity, but out of a genuine sense of meaning in her own life. This realization affected Astrid in a way she hadn't expected. One night, alone at the ranch, Astrid confessed to her mother that she felt lost. She said that when Marcus walked away, she realized she had placed all her bets on someone who had never truly cared. Bernice listened silently, letting the words flow. There was no judgment in her gaze, only firmness. For the first time, her daughter realized that her mother was not just the fragile woman she had tried to control, but a beacon of strength. This conversation marked the beginning of a concrete change. Astrid began to approach her mother's projects, offering practical help. At first, Bernice didn't give her major responsibilities, but allowed small contributions. It was a way to see if her daughter had truly changed. Astrid, to the surprise of many, remained steadfast, willing to learn and repair what she had destroyed. The grandchildren were the glue that held this rebuilding together. They roamed the ranch naturally, creating memories that would have been impossible before. Bernice was moved to tears when she saw them playing in the barn or helping in the garden. She knew that, whatever happened between her and Astrid, she had already planted solid seeds in the children's hearts. And that was enough to make her feel that the family story could have a different future. With her routine becoming increasingly stable, Bernice began dreaming of new projects. She considered transforming part of the property into a community space for meetings, courses, and activities for seniors. She wanted no one else to experience what she had, experienced at Sunset Manor the feeling of being invisible. The idea was enthusiastically received by neighbors, and soon a group of volunteers formed to help. This initiative gave Bernice even more visibility. Local news reports began to appear, telling her story of overcoming adversity. She didn't see herself as a hero, but she knew that sharing her journey could encourage others not to give up. When asked about the secret to her turnaround, she replied simply, "One day, I decided that my life would no longer be decided by others, and I've never looked back." Astrid, seeing her mother publicly recognized, could have felt envy as before, but instead she showed quiet pride. She didn't say much, but she followed every step, perhaps understanding that there was still time to rebuild not only their relationship, but also their lives. Bernice, though suspicious, knew this was significant progress. Nights in Yellowstone became Bernice's favorite time. Sitting on the porch, she would gaze at the starry sky and reflect on the journey she had taken. There was no longer a sense of imprisonment or abandonment. Silence was now a gift, filled with fond memories and the anticipation of a future that could still be lived with dignity. In one of these moments, Bernice wrote in her diary something that summed up her journey. "I didn't just recover land or money, I recovered myself. Today I know no one can steal from me again." Finishing the sentence, she closed the notebook with a peaceful smile, as if she had finally found what she was looking for. The community, her grandchildren, even Astrid, everyone now orbited around the new Bernice. She was no longer the faded woman of Sunset Manor, but a beacon of strength who demonstrated with every gesture that it's never too late to start over. The ranch, once a symbol of her brother, had become a symbol of her own liberation. The community project began simply with weekly meetings in the renovated barn. Initially, just a few neighbors would come to chat, drink coffee, and share experiences, but soon the space took on a life of its own. Craft workshops, computer classes for seniors, and even reading circles became part of the routine. Bernice observed it all with a mixture of pride and humility, realizing that the ranch now served a social purpose. The presence of young scholarship recipients also brought new energy to the place. They volunteered to help with activities, sharing their knowledge and learning from their elders. Bernice was moved to see different generations interacting harmoniously. She often recalled how silent and invisible she had been in the nursing home, contrasting it with the vibrant scene before her eyes. This was proof that her life had found new purpose. Astrid, seeing the project's growth, began to get more involved. She helped organize events, brought in contacts, and gradually gained the community's trust as well. Bernice maintained clear boundaries but recognized that her daughter was genuinely trying. It was as if Astrid had finally understood that the power lies not in control, but in contribution. Still, there were moments of tension. In some discussions about the ranch's future, Astrid's previous authoritarian tone slipped. Bernice firmly reminded her that the decisions were now hers, and that this role had been fought for. Her daughter backed away, knowing there was no more room for backtracking. This constant clash was, in fact, part of the process of rebuilding their relationship. The grandchildren benefited most from all this. Not only did they live with their grandmother in a healthy environment, but they also grew up learning about responsibility, solidarity, and respect. Tommy, in particular, showed interest in following in his grandmother's footsteps in managing the ranch. Bernice saw in him a similar spark to George's, and this filled her with hope for the future. The community came to recognize Bernice's ranch as an essential meeting place. People who previously didn't speak to each other found a neutral space to exchange ideas. Seasonal festivals were organized, complete with music, food, and celebrations that brought different generations together. Bernice, at the center of it all, was seen as the hostess who had transformed her grief into collective strength. With the increase in activities came challenges. There were costs to maintain the space, organize events, and support scholarships. Bernice, however, didn't despair. With Jonathan's help, she created a permanent fund to ensure the continuity of the projects. She knew she wouldn't live forever, but she wanted the legacy to endure beyond her lifetime. This long-term vision moved many, including Astrid. In a rare moment of vulnerability, her daughter said, "Mom, I didn't deserve to be here after everything I've done, but I want you to know I've learned from watching you. It's not about money, it's about leaving something that lasts." Bernice listened silently, but this time she allowed herself to smile. Perhaps forgiveness was indeed on the way. George's letters were still there. In one, he had written, "You were always the strongest even when you didn't believe it. The ranch is just the backdrop. The real change is within you." Bernice kept these words like a mantra. Whenever insecurity threatened to return, she remembered that the greatest transformation had already happened, the internal one. Gradually, the ranch ceased to be merely a symbol of inheritance and became a symbol of reconciliation, not only between mother and daughter, but also among people in the community who found there a space to heal their own pain. Bernice realized that her struggle had not been in vain. On the contrary, it had multiplied into new stories of overcoming. The impact was so great that even foreign media outlets began to take interest. Regional reports highlighted Bernice's journey, showing how she transformed abandonment into community leadership. When giving interviews, she didn't dramatize her story. She spoke simply, as someone who simply refused to accept her fate. This naturalness was what most inspired her listeners. And amidst all this recognition, Bernice discovered something essential. She no longer needed Astrid's approval to feel complete. Reconciliation was welcome, but it wasn't a condition for her happiness. She had found peace within herself, and that was enough. Astrid still had much to prove, but Bernice no longer carried the burden of expecting anything from her. The future was secure because now she was leading it herself. With years of living on the ranch, Bernice no longer carried the weary expression she'd carried from Sunset Manor. Her face now reflected serenity, and the way she walked conveyed assurance. The fear that had once paralyzed her had given way to a calm confidence. She knew she no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, because her life already spoke for itself. Little by little, Astrid became present. Not with the same intensity as before, but in a more balanced way. She spent weekends helping with community activities, and in conversations with her mother, she no longer used the demanding tone that had characterized her in the past. Still, Bernice maintained her inner vigilance. Forgiving wasn't forgetting, and she had learned the importance of not giving up the boundaries she'd established. One special day, Bernice organized a grand celebration at the ranch. She invited the entire community, the young scholarship recipients, friends, neighbors, and of course family. The event brought together hundreds of people, transforming the ranch into a scene of music, dance, and joy. Bernice, observing everything from the porch, felt a unique emotion. This space wasn't just hers, it belonged to everyone who believed in new beginnings. During the party, Astrid approached with her children by her side. For the first time, there was no tension in her expression. She looked at her mother and said in front of everyone, "I heard you, and I know nothing will ever erase that. But today I want to thank you for never giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve it." Silence fell immediately. Bernice took a deep breath and simply replied, Learning respect was the first step. Time will tell the rest. That moment left a lasting impression on everyone. There were no cinematic hugs or exaggerated tears, but a simple truth. The relationship was healing. For Bernice, that was enough. She didn't need perfect reconciliation, just clarity. And the clarity was there. She had freed herself, and if Astrid wanted to walk alongside her, it would be on new terms. The grandchildren were thrilled to see their family closer. For them, the ranch was already a place of happiness, and seeing their mother and grandmother talking peacefully brought relief. Bernice felt proud to realize she was building memories that would mark their lives forever. Memories of strength, dignity, and resilient love. After this celebration, the news spread even further. Bernice's story began to be shared on social media, in lectures, and even in invitations to share her journey at active aging events. She accepted some, always speaking simply, without portraying herself as a hero. Her message was direct. Never let anyone steal from you the chance to choose your own life. This recognition brought a new glow to her days. Bernice, who had once felt invisible, was now seen and heard by far beyond her community. More than applause, what touched her were the letters she received from strangers, thanking her for inspiring courage in similar situations. She treasured each one like a silent trophy. Astrid, for her part, began her own path of reconstruction. Encouraged by her mother, she sought therapy, reorganized her finances, and learned to rely less on others. Bernice watched from afar, without interfering but with satisfaction. She saw in her daughter the possibility of real change, albeit slow, and this time she wasn't fooled by promises. She expected consistent action. For Bernice, the greatest victory wasn't the money or even the ranch. It was regaining her ability to decide who she was. The Sunset Manor years weren't erased, but now they had a different meaning. They were a reminder of how capable she was of resisting and starting over. The contrast was so stark that when she remembered those white hallways, it seemed like she was thinking of another life. Person. The ranch continued to grow as a space for gathering and transformation. Young people came and went, projects multiplied, and the house became increasingly vibrant. Bernice, sitting on the porch on her quiet afternoons, knew she was leaving something greater than any material inheritance. She was leaving an example of courage, rebirth, and resilience. And, deep down, this was the climax of her story. Bernice was no longer the invisible woman who accepted what others decided. She was the woman who chose freedom, who built a legacy, and who showed with simplicity that it's never too late to rise up. The wound with Astrid might never completely heal, but that no longer defined her. She had achieved something far more important, the right to be fully her own person. Over time, the ranch established itself as a landmark in Yellowstone. People traveled from other towns to learn about Bernice's story and participate in community activities. The place, which had previously seemed too big for her, now fit perfectly into her life. Every corner had a function, every wall held stories, and every tree bore witness to her new phase. Bernice maintained a morning journaling habit. It was there that she recorded her achievements, her learnings, and even the challenges that still arose. She never romanticized life. She knew there would always be difficulties, but she also knew she had the tools to face them. This journal became not only a companion, but also a future legacy for grandchildren and even strangers to understand her journey. Astrid continued to appear, but no longer with hidden agendas. Now she came with simplicity, sometimes bringing flowers, other times just to listen to her mother. Bernice, unhurried, allowed these gestures. The bond wasn't perfect, but it was being rebuilt patiently. Most importantly, the relationship was no longer one of control, but of respect. The grandchildren, grown and growing closer to their grandmother, became guardians of this new story. They spoke proudly of Bernice's strength, repeated her phrases in conversations with friends, and saw in her an example of how to face life. For Bernice, this was the greatest proof that her pain had been transformed into something good, a solid emotional legacy that would extend beyond money and land. Once in an interview with a local newspaper, Bernice was asked what overcoming meant to her. She smiled and replied, "Overcoming isn't forgetting what happened. It's choosing no longer live as a victim of the past. I chose to live, and that made all the difference." The phrase made the headline the next day, inspiring even more people. Nights remained her favorite time. Sitting on the porch, a blanket draped over her shoulders, she gazed at the starry sky and remembered her brother George. She often murmured to herself, "Thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't." His presence still seemed alive in the letters, on the ranch, and even in the wind that blew through the fields. Over the years, the community project grew to the point where it no longer depended solely on her. Volunteers, partners, and even institutions supported her. Bernice knew she had laid the groundwork for her work to endure even after she was gone. This gave her peace because she understood that life is measured not only by what one lives, but by what one leaves behind for others. Astrid finally showed clear signs of transformation. She managed to get back on her feet after her separation from Marcus, found stability at work, and began actively supporting her mother's projects. Although the past still lingered, Bernice no longer saw her as just the daughter who had betrayed her, but also as a woman rebuilding. The relationship, though imperfect, had found a viable path. On a sunny afternoon, Bernice gathered her children, grandchildren, neighbors, and friends for a simple celebration at the ranch. It wasn't a birthday nor a holiday. It was just an ordinary day she decided to make special. During the gathering, she stood up and said, "You are proof that there's no age limit for starting over. Never let anyone tell you your worth is gone. I am living proof of that." The emotional silence that followed was more eloquent than any applause. The community responded with gratitude, and Bernice felt an indescribable emotion. It wasn't vanity. It was the feeling of finally being in the right place, with the right people, living a life that made sense. Before her reflected every impact of her journey. She had gone from being invisible to becoming an inspiration. That night, writing in her journal, Bernice ended with a sentence that seemed to sum it all up. "Today, I know I'm not just a survivor. I'm free." As she closed the notebook, she felt a deep peace, as if the cycle had come full circle. There was no longer any fear, no submission. There was only the certainty that she had won. And so, Bernice Walsh, once forgotten in a nursing home and considered incompetent, ended her journey proving that dignity has no age and that freedom can be achieved even in the final chapters of life. Her legacy was not just a ranch or a fortune, but the message that it's never too late to start over.